I've always been very trusting of others. Only now have I started to understand that trust is just another word for gullible. My past is littered with situations where my good nature was taken advantage of, or literally trampled. From kindergarten until last night, I must have a giant S etched to my forehead for being such a sucker. The thing is, users don't care who they hurt. They sail through life without the handicap or hindrance of a moral conscience. My problem is, I can't recognize them for who they are until they've already taken advantage of me. Sometimes not even then. I see good in everyone, even when it's not really there. It's a curse to be this foolishly optimistic. Last night, I received a call from a girl in my abnormal psychology class. Nancy and I sat across from each other and shared a laugh or two over lunch a few weeks ago. When I answered her call, she was positively hysterical. It took me at least 5 minutes to calm her down enough to figure out what she was so worked up about. She stammered something indecipherable about a mandatory fraternity pledge and Hell Night hazing. She carried on about other things, but the rest of it was just gibberish to me. Honestly, at first I assumed she was probably drunk. I really didn't know her very well, but she seemed nice enough. After a few more minutes of the tense exchange, she managed to choke out a few semi-intelligible details and an address. I assumed she was hoping I'd pick her up and give her a ride back to her dorm, but I was never able to confirm that. The place was a few miles from campus in the shady part of town. Before I could get a more lucid summary of what was going on or the reason for the frantic call, I heard an angry man's voice in the background. The phone went dead immediately after that. I called her back, but it went straight to voicemail. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I didn't know what to do about any of it. I was hesitant to call the police because I had no proof there was anything actually wrong with her. Maybe she was just drunk. Worse, I didn't even know Nancy's last name. It's not like I would have been taken seriously. Against my better judgment, I got in the car and drove to the address to see if she needed my help. The truth is, I'm not the sort of guy who would ever join a fraternity, nor do I make it a habit of driving around to visit the bad part of town at 2 a.m. I just didn't want it on my conscience that a classmate needed a safe ride home, and I ignored her call. According to my GPS, I was on the right block, but the actual street address was a little elusive. With her voice so slurred and hysterical, I wasn't even sure what number she said. I kept calling her cell while slowly cruising up and down the streets and dark alleys. I felt hopeless. All the houses and industrial buildings looked the same, and none of them had lights on. She wasn't even answering. I drove back and forth for at least 10 minutes before I caught a break. There, parked on the side of the alley, was a car with a student permit from the university. I didn't know what kind of car she drove, but I heard a cell ringtone when I tried her number again. On the ground, I found her phone. The screen was smashed up, but it was definitely hers. I could still read my number on the cracked display. That sent my emotions from worry and apprehension to a rising level of deep concern. It still wasn't proof of foul play, but it did point to highly suspicious circumstances. The car was unlocked. I felt pretty nervous looking through it, but if it was hers, there might be clues inside. A quick survey of the front and back seats and floorboards confirmed it was empty of obvious answers. I set the smashed phone on the driver's seat and put mine away. There was no point in trying to call her any longer. She wasn't going to answer. A smarter man than I would have called the cops and tried to explain the vague circumstances, or just went home. I did neither. I tried to guess which of the dormant-looking houses nearby she might be inside. I didn't want to wake up any residents based upon circumstantial theories or suspicions, but I also didn't want to abandon Nancy if she was being held against her will or assaulted. I narrowed it down to the 4 closest locations to the unlocked car. By that time, it was after 2:30 a.m. I was tired, nervous, and a bit aggravated at being pulled into such a nerve-wracking drama fest. Her broken phone still wasn't proof of personal danger or wrongdoing. It was little more than electronic litter at that point. For all I knew, she had dropped it in a drunken stupor and stumbled back into the house she was visiting to sleep it off. I couldn't barge into someone's home in the middle of the night and demand to know if she was inside and okay. At that point, I was pretty fed up with the whole ordeal and ready to drive home when I noticed something very alarming. Both of my hands were stained with something dark. I turned on the overhead dome light. It looked an awful lot like semi-dried blood. As you can imagine, I freaked out. I turned them over, back and forth to see if I was injured, but the sheer volume of the stain made it difficult to tell. It was possible I'd cut myself on Nancy's cracked screen, but if it really was human blood, it seemed like too much to be coming from something minor like that. I got out of the car and went back over to the student vehicle. I took a clean napkin from my glove compartment and wiped the sides of the back of her busted phone. My heart sank when I looked at it. The thick, white paper was covered in a brownish-red residue. I knew it was blood, and there was far too much of it to be from a simple glass cut. At that moment, I should have called the police. I know that now, but I was afraid Nancy was in imminent danger, and I couldn't wait. I took matters into my own blood-stained hands. Emboldened by fear and adrenaline, I went and aggressively rapped on the nearest door. Dogs began to bark up the street. Neighbors' lights went up at several of the nearby houses, and someone tried to scare me off by yelling they were about to call the cops. I just yelled for them to go ahead. They didn't seem to anticipate that I wanted them to. I continued pounding on the door, but no one came to answer. Instead, it just drifted open from the sheer intensity of my knocks. The lights were out inside. I shouted for Nancy, but there was no answer. Flipping the light switch didn't do a damn thing. I soon realized that the place was abandoned. There was smeared blood on the doorknob and switch plates. I used my phone as a flashlight, but it kept dying on me. I yelled for Nancy until my voice was hoarse, and I cautiously crept through the empty rooms hoping to find her injured, but alive. The place had been vacant for some time based on what I could tell. And that was a huge relief. I didn't want to be shot as an intruder. In the long hallway at the back of the abandoned house, I heard what I believed to be a faint cry for help. I stopped calling out for a moment and just tried to listen. There was a closed door at the end of the hall with a flickering glow underneath. Since the place had no electricity, I assumed it was evidence of candles, a cigarette lighter, or a flashlight. "Nancy!" I yelled, but was only met with silence. I tried the doorknob. It was locked, but when I grasped it, I felt someone gripping it from the other side of the door. I assumed it was her trying to get out. I beat on the paneled wood and yelled for her to stand back. I heard a very faint voice say something indecipherable from the other side. I shouted that I couldn't understand, but was going to knock down the door. With the impact of my shoulder against the surface, it splintered and finally gave way. To my great surprise, I fell downward into a cold blackness. I assumed the threshold must have led to a stairway in a lower floor, but I was knocked unconscious by the fall. The next thing I knew, I was here, defending my innocence over a series of bizarre occult sacrifices which apparently took place in the cellar of that vacant house. I fully admit my hands were covered in someone's blood, but I swear, I had nothing to do with their deaths. Every single word of this testimony is completely true. I've never been to that location before, nor have I ever met or harmed any of the victims you found on the sacrificial altar. You can check my cell records. It will show a call I received at 2 a.m. from a classmate named Nancy. I don't know who is speaking to me from the other side of the door, but they were trying to frame me for these gruesome crimes. I'm thankful the neighbor followed through with her promise to call the police. Otherwise, I'd be just as dead as the others.
Please leave your message